It's a huge honour and privilege for me to be here talking with Ian. Ian is not only the nation's favourite novelist, but he's my favourite novelist. And I want to begin, Ian, by suggesting to you that a novelist is a bit of a scientist. A novelist is a psychologist. He has to have a theory of mind. His job is to get you and me me as the reader inside the mind of someone else to understand them. And more than that, he's a surgeon. He's better than Mr. Perrone in Saturday. He can actually go inside the brain of people and throw switches. In a sense, there is a parallel between what a scientist is doing in trying to understand the brain and what a novelist is doing in understanding and manipulating the human brain.
I think that's right. I often say, somewhat pinching the thought but adapting it from Milan Kundera, that literature is really an investigation of human nature. I mean, that seems to be its field largely. The theory of mind, the assumption that we have innate hardwired sense not only of what other minds are like and what it is to be like someone else, but also reflexively how we are reflected in their eyes. And I know that cognitive psychologists tell us that that reciprocal process can happen up to 4 or 5 times, quite easily and without a lot of forethought. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because literature does require some incredible and extraordinary mental acts from readers, and we take them for granted. And I would have thought that the novel was a special case, a sort of simply a refinement of something that we do quite well. It does offer us a route into other minds. We do find that with matters like free indirect style, in other words, that style of writing, that little trick by which we represent the world in the third person, but through the mind or through the vocabulary of one of the characters. You find it patchily in the 18th century, but it arrives fully formed, beautifully formed in the work of Jane Austen. You see it there in Jane Austen. You get the sense of a world from a character who's described in the third person, but also the novelist has the luxury of inhabiting that character and colouring the world from inside that character's view. That the reader can read a sentence of a Jane Austen novel automatically and take in 2 or 3 or 4 points of view. There is the author, there's possibly a narrator, there's a character, and the character is maybe being mocked, or the character is also being defended from his or her own innermost thoughts. It's an extraordinary thing. So I think novelists do share something with science, except that science is a third-person act, I'd say. Mm-hmm. And it still can't give us, however marvellous its descriptions are of the mind, or more crucially of the brain, it can't give us the fine print of consciousness.
Okay, well, Solar is a book that's about science, not just in the sense of being about the scientific way of seeing the world, but about science as a tribe. And maybe it's your first book in which you've set it in a setting of academic science. And as you say, Michael Beard is very human, is all too human. And in the end, he's corrupt. He steals an idea from someone else. Well, that's the least of his crimes. But yeah. Are you saying that science is corrupt?
No, let's put it this way, that it's very difficult to write a novel about climate change. Well, it's very difficult to write a novel about anything, but climate change has certain sort of rebarbative elements to it. Statistics, hard science, physics, maths, virtue. I mean, there's a great temptation to be preachly about this, and for a long time I avoided this subject. And then I was invited to Potsdam a few years ago, and I went along to this climate change meeting in Potsdam, organized by John Schellnhuber, who is Angela Merkel's special scientific advisor. And the gimmick of this conference was that all the speakers were Nobel Prize winners, big beasts of the scientific jungle, all men, super alpha males, men of a certain age too. And I was invited along really as a sort of after-dinner mint. My job was to give a little talk at the end of supper. So I found myself in a room with 35 Nobel Prize winners. And these were men who had control of not only of university budgets, but big institutions and government, where government met science. But they weren't doing any science, mostly. And most of their work was done in their 20s, that got them their gong. And so I thought how marvelous it would be to have a character who lived in his own shadow, who did this work 20, 30 years ago, and then becomes a minor celebrity and just coasts on this. And that gave me the sense that there would be a way into a novel that had climate change as its background noise if I could only award him a Nobel Prize. I awarded this prize and said airily to myself and on the page that he'd got it for modifying Einstein's photovoltaics, for which Einstein got his prize. When I got to the end of the novel, I thought, well, I still don't know what he did to get this prize. And fortunately, I met a mutual friend of ours, Graham Mitchison, who's both a biologist, a biologist and a mathematician and a physicist, and asked him if he would reverse engineer for me this prize. And so he wrote a citation, and I learned at last from Graham Mitchison what Michael Beard had done. I had not.
So Graham really deserves a prize.
I sent him a case of champagne. Maybe that's not enough. But I wouldn't want to suggest that in all the chaos around this scoundrel figure that all scientists are like this, or for that matter, all people. But I have to say, Matt, that I know we take slightly different views on this, but when the climate change conference in Copenhagen happened, I thought, well, by the time it ended, I thought, well, crucial aspects of human nature have been demonstrated for us. Possibly for the first time in diplomatic history and in international politics, rationality in the form of science had summoned every last country on earth to one place. That's one side of our nature. And on the other side, everything that happened as soon as they got there. Not only did God send a blizzard descending on those queuing up to get into the building to discuss global warming, but also very soon there was all kinds of short-term thinking, cabals. Obama, rather disgracefully, I think, came and played things out for the American networks. The Chinese were devious beyond belief. The Europeans sulked in their tents. And the whole thing ended in farce and great disappointment. And I thought, with no real pleasure, the whole spirit of my novel and of Michael Beard was at Copenhagen. I mean, I'm trying to really render a sympathetic account of us in the West as privileged consumers, unable really to ever pause in our delicious lives, and try and relate this a little to Michael Beard's gluttony. He hurried across baggage reclaim, past the creaking carousels and bored crowds beneath the information screens, through deserted customs, then out along the lines of dead-eyed drivers and their boards, Q8 balloon adventures, Bishop Dolan, Ted of Mr. Kipling, and crossed the departure hall, fully aware that he was not quite making a direct line to the stairs that led down to his train, nor was he quite aiming for the down-at-heel airport shop that sold newspapers, luggage straps, and related clutter. Was he going to be weak and go in there as he always did? He thought not. But his route was bending that way. He was a public intellectual of a sort. He needed to be informed, and it was natural he should buy a newspaper, however pressed for time. He knew this shop too well, and it seemed he was walking directly towards it now. Well, he was simply going to go in and take a look, test his will, buy a newspaper, and nothing besides. If only it were pornography that he was trying to resist, then failure could do him no harm. But pictures of girls or parts of girls no longer stirred him much. His problem was even more banal than top-rack glossies. Now he was at the counter, sorting the pound coins from euros in his hand, with 4 newspapers under his arm, not one, as if excess in one endeavour might immunise him in another. And as he handed them across for their barcodes to be scanned, he saw at the edge of vision, in the array beneath the till, the gleam of a thing he wanted, the thing he did not want to want. A dozen of them in a line, and without deciding to, he was taking one, so light, and adding it to his pile, partly obliterating a picture of the Prime Minister waving from the doorway of a church. It was a plastic foil bag of finely sliced potatoes, boiled in oil and dusted in salt, industrialized powdered foodstuffs and preservatives, enhancers, hydrolyzing and raising agents, acidity regulators and colouring, salt and vinegar flavoured crisps. He was still stuffed from his airplane lunch, but this particular chemical feast could not be found in Paris, Berlin or Tokyo, and he longed for it now, the actinic sting of these 30 grams, a drug dealer's measure. One last jolt to the system, then he would never touch the junk again. The flight from Berlin was a typical failure. At the start, as he lowered his broad rear into his seat barely 2 hours after a meaty Germanic breakfast, he was forming his resolutions. No drinks but water, no snacks, a green leaf salad, a portion of fish, no pudding. And at the same time, at the approach of a silver tray and the murmured invitation of a female voice, his hand was closing round the stem of his runway champagne. A half hour later, he was ripping open the sachet of a salt-studded beef-glazed toasted corn-type Sticklets snack that came with his jumbo gin and tonic. Then there was spread before him a white tablecloth, the sight of which fired some neuronal starter gun for his stomach juices. The gin melted his remaining resolve. He chose the starter he had decided against, quail's legs wrapped in bacon on a bed of creamed garlic. Then cubes of pork belly mounted on a hill fort of buttered rice. The word pave was another of those starter guns, a paving slab of chocolate sponge encased in chocolate under a chocolate sauce. Then goat's cheese, cow's cheese and a nest of white grapes, 3 rolls, a chocolate mint, 3 glasses of burgundy. And finally, as though it would absolve him of all else, he forced himself back through the menu to confront the oil-sodden salad that came with the quail. And when his tray was removed, only the grapes remained.